and I am going to be muting the microphones.
Thank you, Phil. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I hope it's a good moment for you. I'd like to welcome you to the third webinar in our 2018 webinar series for the International Listening Association. I'm really excited about today's webinar, and it created quite a lot of buzz, so I imagine that we're going to have a lot of people joining us as we move throughout, which is why Phil has turned off the microphones. We will turn those on at certain points, but if you would like to participate, there's also a chat feature at the bottom, which Phil will be talking about in a second. The title of our webinar is So You Think You Can Listen, Listening 101, It's Deeper Than You Think. Actually, that's the title of the first portion of it, and you're going to see that today we've mixed things up a little bit. We have two speakers, Anita Dorczak and Sheila Bentley, and Anita will take us through two programs and Sheila will take us through one program at the end. But before we get there, let's give you some webinar tips. Phil, can I ask you for your help with this one?
Absolutely. Thank you, Laura, and welcome everybody. We're really glad to have you. Just a few tips to make this webinar a little better for everybody. I am going to mute all microphones except the presenters at the through the webinar until a specific time in order to reduce the possibility of feedback. If you would like to ask a question or send a message, just use the chat feature, which is located on the bottom, for most people on the bottom of their screen, and you could see the little comment balloon icon, and you could just go in there and type in your question or anything else. When you're leaving the meeting, which is not yet, but the only thing you have to do is click End Meeting, and we hope you have an enjoyable time. And once again, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Phil. Let's introduce yourself and me for a second here before we get to our speakers today. I'm Laura Janusik. I'm a professor at Rockhurst University in Kansas City, Missouri, which is where I am right now, even though I know you can't see behind me. I'm a professor and also a consultant. My research areas are listening cognitions, metacognitions, and pedagogy. I've been an ILA member since 1998 and past president in 2010. And then we have the infamous Phil, who is our technical director. Tell us about yourself, Phil.
Hi, everybody. Yes, I'm instructor of communication studies here at Northern Virginia Community College, and I've actually been here for going on 18 years. I'm also a Virginia master teacher, and my specialty area is listening and student success. And like Laura, I was also president of the ILA in 2015 and 2016.
And not to say that we're stacked with presidential people, but our first guest speaker is actually Anita Dorczak, and she is the first vice president of the International Listening Association as we speak, and she'll be moving up to president in the future then. Anita is a lawyer, a mediator, and a trainer from Edmonton, Canada. She has a law degree and a PhD from the University of Alberta and a master's degree in English philology, which I just asked her what that meant. So if you are curious about that, you can ask her that during our Q&A. Anita is a certified elder mediator, a certified parenting coordinator, and a certified listening professional. She presents workshops and papers all around the globe, actually, and she's members of lots of different organizations like the Canadian Bar Association and the Academy of Professional Family Mediators. She speaks 3 languages fluently, and she's also studied 3 additional languages. So it's quite possible that you might be able to ask a question in your native tongue, and she might be able to respond. Those languages, in addition to English, would be Polish and Spanish, Latin, French, and Russian. So I am going to actually turn it over to Anita. Anita, I'm going to have to stop sharing and you can take it over.
Okay, well, great. Thank you so much, and good morning or good afternoon or good day to you or good night to you. What I'm going to do now is to present a presentation on how to prepare to listen. And I want to say a couple of words about what it's like, because the name is and was a little bit foreign to Laura, and we had a good little laugh about that. What I'm going to show you now is an example of Pecha Kucha. So Pecha Kucha is essentially a presentation style that consists of 20 slides, and you have 20 seconds per slide. And you're not supposed to be having any words on the slides. You're supposed to have images, and through the images, you tell the story. So it originated in Japan. It means essentially chit-chat. So let me see. I tried to time myself, and let's see if I pass, if I can squeeze it into 6 minutes and 40 seconds. The challenge is on. So the title is, So You Think You Can Listen, eh? And that's very Canadian for those of you who have not realized that. As Canadian as you can get, eh? And it is deeper than you think. So let me start now. From the moment we rise in the morning until the time when we go to bed, guess what you do almost all day long? Well, we communicate, and research says that we do it about 70% of our working hours. What we do during that time is we write about 9% of the time, we read about 16% of the time, and we talk for about 1/3 of the time. But most of the time, we listen. Yet, we take it for granted that we are good at listening because we hear what is being said. So, listening is a very complex process. It used to be defined as the ability to understand spoken language, but it is really a complex process now, and you should prepare for it mentally, emotionally, and you may not believe it, but physical preparation would also serve you well. So what you see here are the diffusion tensor imaging, images of the brain on the left, the heart in the middle, and then a simple symbol for physical preparation. So let me start with the mental preparation. Meditation is a practice of mental hygiene to cleanse the mind and to strengthen the mind. We live in a time when we have a lot of scientific evidence about numerous benefits of meditation. It's known to reduce anxiety and stress, and it will help you focus when you prepare to listen. And listening, before in a listening event, it's good to set an intention to listen. So it's like setting a goal, and you can come to that intention anytime that your mind wanders. To continue with the mental preparation, be ready to listen with an open mind. Do not pronounce any judgments on the speakers until you have come to understand their message. And moving on with the mental preparation to enable you to listen really well, you can actually read about the subject ahead of time. It's sort of like being back at school, at the university, when your favorite prof is about to lecture and you really want to find out about the subject, and you can then read before so you can ask very good questions. To continue with your preparation, now we are moving to emotional preparation. You see the picture of the heart in the corner. Emotional preparation to listen will help you manage your emotions. And particularly at the time when your very hot buttons are being pushed. I know my hot button, and it's the overuse of the word like. Like, you know, like now, like what's yours? Well, when you prepare to listen emotionally, you will be able to listen to any topic, and you will know ahead of time which subjects would actually trigger an emotional response in you. So how about racism? How about ageism? How about gay marriage? Are you experiencing any kind of reaction? Well, Do not let bad grammar of the speaker to prevent you from listening in an emotionally competent way. We live in a multicultural society. In my country, we have about 20% immigrant population. So some of us do not speak English 100% correctly. Continuing with the emotional preparation, can you listen to the accent? How about my accent? Can you listen to the accent even if you do not like it? Well, we may sound differently, but are accents sexy? Some research says that people who speak with accents are perceived as more educated and wise. Well, we do not all sound like Her Majesty the Queen right here. To continue with your preparation, now moving on to physical portion of your preparation. Well, what about it? Listening, we know from research, takes a lot of energy. So what do you need to do to get ready and to get your body ready to listen well? First of all, get enough sleep. Yes, go to your cave, sleep with no electronics around. Then also feed your body well. Make sure you do not become hungry as you're listening, because then the hunger and the thirst can become your distractions. And moving on with your preparation, your body hopefully is no longer naked, at least for most of the time when you listen. So put comfortable clothing on it and let your body be relaxed and let your body support you well during the listening event. To continue with your physical preparation, get ready to take notes, either in the old-fashioned way with the pen and a pad, or typing actually on some very fancy electronic device, so you can remember what you have listened to. And research says that we only retain about 10% or maybe a little bit more of what we actually have listened to. So now that you have gone through, as you can see, the mental preparation at the top, the emotional preparation, the picture of the heart, and the physical preparation at the bottom, what is there left to do for you to become the world's best listener? Well, number one law of effective listening is to stop talking. Yes, as my favorite Buddhist monk, Thich Nhat Hanh, said, quote, "The most precious gift we can offer anyone is our attention." And also, number two law of effective listening would be stop doing what you have been doing. Open up all of your senses so you can perceive your message fully. And finally, number three law of effective listening would be, if you want to listen, don't be afraid to ask questions. Asking open-ended questions will allow you to learn more about the message that the speaker is bringing you. So now that you have actually prepared to listen mentally, emotionally, and you eliminated interruptions, you are ready to ask questions, and you stop doing what you have been doing, now look in the corner. You have been promoted from one ear to two-ear listening. And now, from Edmonton, Canada, this is your listening lawyer. The end.
Terrific. Thanks, Anita.
So this is the end. This is the end of Pecha Kucha.
And why don't you tell our listeners why you wanted to do a I have such a hard time saying that, Pecha Chuka today.
It's so charming, Laura. It's Pecha Kucha. And I wanted to invite the listeners to look at something that they might not have seen in the past. And I would very much welcome these kinds of submissions for the upcoming conference in Vancouver. A little bit more about that later. But this is one of the formats of presentations that I would very much like to introduce in the convention. And I think it will be a lot of fun. The idea has to be conveyed just by images. So we could also have a competition for the best Pecha Kucha of the afternoon or something like that. So I think that would be really cool. So that was one of the reasons why. And the second reason was to challenge myself to actually convey the idea by the image. If you haven't done it, it's extremely difficult to do. Actually, I spent 2 full days looking at hundreds of images, and they appear very simple. I hope they carry the message, but it's a very challenging task.
I can imagine it is. Let's go ahead and see if anyone has any questions at this point in time before we go to the second presentation. Questions or comments? Anybody want to go through the chat? It looks like not, Anita. So we can go directly into your major presentation then.
Okay.
If you want to go ahead and share screen again, that would be terrific.
Okay, we are just getting there. Okay. Okay. So this is the kind, in the meantime, this is the sort of something that probably a lot of the people on the call are familiar with. Can we see this? No.
Yeah.
All right. You can see the image, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. So this format is sort of akin to something that is known as a TED Talk. So TED stands for Technology, Entertainment, and Design, and it's about ideas worth spreading. And can I disappear as well, please, so I can actually have the slides? And what this originated in the United States in 1984, if you can imagine going back so far. So these are topics that make a difference, topics that people are passionate about. The speakers are given a maximum of 18 minutes to present the idea in the most innovative and engaging way they can. So my topic today is how to listen to family disagreement. And this is going to be just from the perspective of a family lawyer who has worked with the families for almost 30 years now. And I listen to these family disagreements regularly in my office. And sometimes I take them home as well and continue. Anyway, so let me start with a little overview of what I will be talking about. I will be talking about what conflict is, a little bit about how we react to conflict, and also about the definition of conflict. And what about control over the listening that we have or may not have as we listen to disagreement, and also about different settings and how we listen in different settings. So let me start with the definition of conflict, and our learned dictionaries as Oxford and Cambridge, when they define conflict, the reference is made to arguments or opposing opinions, opposing principles. But there's also another definition of conflict that actually weaves in the topic of the relationship. So it's a relationship between people who either think that they have, or actually they do have, incompatible goals. And that's, of course, something that happens very frequently when I listen to people here in my office. So when we talk about conflict, we looked at different aspects. It's not just one thing. We have an emotional aspect to conflict, and that frequently prevents a lot of people from moving forward. We have the legal aspect to conflict as well, financial, and communication. And research says that couples separate, about 52% of couples in the States separate because of the breakdown of communication. So this is a huge area that needs some focus and some improvement in the future. When we look at conflict and people come to see me, they talk about positions. So they say, I want the house, I want the kids, you're not going to get them. But really how they make decisions is based on their interests. So interests are really the things that matter, the values, what their beliefs, what they really will base their decision on. And then deep down, there are needs of the parties, and these needs must be satisfied before conflict could be actually resolved. Now, I hear some noise right now. I don't know if somebody should be still muting the microphone. I don't know if everybody hears, but I hear some noise. I hope it's not disturbing. Moving on to the story of the orange. So this is a story, let's say, of a Johnny and Susie. And mom comes and the kids are fighting. They are teenagers. I want that orange. And mom says, well, Susie, why do you want this orange? because I can actually slice it in half for you. And Susie says, Mom, no, I just want the peel because I want to bake my favorite cookies. And she turns to Johnny and says, Johnny, why did you want the orange? Well, I want juice, Mom. So guess what Mom does? She does not slice the orange in half. That's a compromise, but we can also creatively deal with the orange in a different way. So Johnny gets his juice, and Susie gets her orange peel to bake the cookies. How do we react to conflict? There are different conflict styles. There's accommodating attitude to conflict, competing, avoiding, and also collaborating. By the way, collaborating being my favorite as I'm a collaborative attorney. So a little bit more about competing. What does that mean? Well, as I said before, I want the house. I want the outcome. I want to win, and I don't care about you. And the good image of this is from all the way from Australia. Well, one will win and one will lose, and that's the result. Moving on to avoiding type of conflict style. When we look at this is, well, I don't have anything to do with it. I will run away. I really don't care about you involved in this. I don't care about the outcome. I am like this bird here with my head deep down, buried in the sand. And of course, then the conflict doesn't get resolved. So we have a lose-lose result. What about accommodating? Well, this is a concern for the people. And really, I don't care about the outcome that much. So a picture that I found was when our Canadian geese go down to Florida, to your beautiful country, and there's a leader, and the other ones say, well, okay, you can leave, that's fine, I will accommodate you, we'll fly there. And finally, collaborating. What does that mean? We care about the people involved, and we care about what happens. So the outcome is important to us as well. The cutest picture I could find are the otters holding hands. So when they sleep, none of them would float away to the sea. What is the result of collaborating conflict style? Well, it's a win-win result. And I think that's a very important idea to keep in mind when you're dealing with conflict. Leo Tolstoy, many years ago, in Anna Karenina said, all happy families are alike, but each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And this is very true, even though the family conflict that I see repeats itself around different issues, each family, when they come, presents it differently. What are the issues? Well, you probably have heard of custody battles and then the child support to be paid. Maybe a spouse is asking for spousal support and the house has to be split in half. And of course, then what about the gambling debt that the spouse has accumulated during the cohabitation? So the big question arises, and the question is how? How to listen to family disagreements. And are you in control? Let me present 3 different scenarios and then comment a little bit about the control that you may have. So the first one is when the 2 spouses are talking. That's one scenario. The other one is when the spouse, one of them comes to see a lawyer for a consultation. And the third one is when the spouse is actually listening to a judge. And how do we deal with this? Well, I would suggest to you that as a spouse participating in a conflict conversation, you have 100% control over what you listen to and what you say. When it comes to spouse and lawyer interaction, that control of yours is diminishing. And when you actually enter the courtroom and you are before the judge, then you really have no control over that. So think about that for a moment. Are you really in control? What about the setting? I have chosen 3 different settings. So one is the kitchen table, a lawyer's office, and then the courtroom. Let me invite you to the kitchen. Here's the kitchen table negotiation. So what happens at the kitchen table? Well, the spouse and spouse come sit down at this beautiful red table. They start talking, and I would submit to you that the goal is to understand. So you're listening to understand the other spouse's position. What would be the best behavior and the rule to honor here? A very simple rule, but very important. Do not interrupt. You also, when you're talking to a spouse, you have to actually have a little bit of patience. And you also have to try to find things that you have in common. Perhaps you can agree on something during that conversation. And that would be very important because then that would allow you to move forward. So let me give you an example of one of my files. I'm acting for the husband. That's a long-term marriage, over 20 years. There is a son who is an adult now. The husband had an affair many, many years ago. From that affair, a child was born. So there was a lot of resentment over the years. And they were bickering and not really able to come to terms. The lawyer for the wife drafted minutes of settlement, which is a contract that people would sign if they actually do agree. So my client came to see me a week ago, and he says, you know what, I will be able to sign this contract. And I looked at him and said, oh, what happened? And he said, well, you know, we went to the kitchen table, we sat down, we talked about our life, we tried to understand what happened. And that understanding helped us move forward. So actually, we are now able to sign this contract. Moving on to lawyer's office. I'm inviting you to my office. This is when you enter. And this is where we would sit to actually have a conflict conversation and see what we can resolve. So what happens in the lawyer's office when the spouse comes and talks to a lawyer? I would submit to you your goal in that interaction would be listen to learn about your legal options. And what would be the best rule to honor here? I would suggest it would be restating the information that the lawyer is providing to you. You have to be ready to be interrupted by a lawyer, and you have to insist on explaining what the lawyer is tell you. And lawyers are unfortunately quite notorious about interruptions, and we talk over people, we talk over clients, and we talk over our colleagues as well. So get ready for that, but do stand your ground and restate before you leave what advice has been given to you. Moving on to this place. Well, not very inviting, is it? You could even have the jurors here to your right who would be listening to everything you have to say. But let's fast forward and look at this interaction, spouse and the judge. And this is when the judge is giving his or her verdict. So really at that point, you have to listen to accept the decision of the judge. And that's a very difficult thing to do. And the rule here I would submit to you would be to take notes. To take notes to really understand what the judge has said. And let me give you a little story of one of my files. I act for a young mother of a 7-year-old son, and we brought an application for sort of an interim application, so without live evidence, for a custody of that son. And I asked my client as we entered the courtroom to take notes. And I said, remember, please take notes of everything that the judge is going to say. And I gave her the pen, and she had the pad and paper. And we argued. We presented the arguments to the judge. We argued the case. The decision came down. We come out of the courtroom. And I'm looking at her saying, well, okay, so. And she's looking at me and said, well, what did the judge say? And she looks at me, and I said, well, and she says, I don't know. Didn't you take notes? No, I didn't. Well, I said, we won. Okay, the words that I use quite rarely, but yes, we did win the custody. And she looked at me, and she had this beautiful look in her eyes, and she gave me the biggest hug in the world. But the page of her notes remained empty. There was nothing taken down, no notes. So what have I talked about today? 3 scenarios. The first one was the spouse-to-spouse negotiation in family disagreement. And the rule to keep in mind would be do not interrupt. And weaving that back into the presentation on preparation and preparing to listen, I would suggest to you that your focus on preparation here should be emotional. So remember those red hot buttons, don't let the spouse push them for you, okay? Then the second scenario I was talking about was the spouse and the lawyer interaction. And my suggestion here was to learn the options, to restate the legal advice given to you. And then the focus, I think, for your preparation should be mental. So perhaps you should meditate a little bit. Maybe there are other things you can do that I suggested before. but come to the lawyer's office ready to listen. And finally, if and when you have to listen to the judge, you have to listen to accept that decision. And it would be very good to take notes. And your focus for your preparation, I would suggest, would be physical, because sometimes you have to listen for a long time. To sum up, what have I talked about today? Well, I talked a little bit about conflict and what it means. Talked about conflict styles. Remember the collaborating type of conflict resolution being one. And also I talked a little bit about control, the degree of control that you will have over a listening event, and different settings and how that may determine how you actually listen. And the three of them were dealing with listening between spouses, listening to a lawyer, and listening to the judge. From the Rocky Mountains of Canada to all of you on the call, thank you so very much for listening today.
Thanks, Anita. We have moved to the point of question and answer. So people who have questions for Anita, Phil, is there a possibility of people to raise their hand, or do we just want to go through on chat?
They could get on chat, or I can unmute.
Let's go ahead and have people type questions into chat.
Sure thing.
So whatever question you have for Anita, please go ahead to the chat feature and type that in. Anita, you'll find this funny. Somebody wanted to know how to spell Pekachuka, Kucha. Is that right, Pekachuka?
No, Pechacucha, P-E-C-H-A, and the second word is K-U-C-H-A, K-U-C-H-A.
Pechacucha.
Just like cha-cha-cha.
Anita, I actually have a question for you. You had cited that in the U.S., 52% of couples break up because of lack of communication. And I knew that stat, but I was wondering, is that similar for other countries, or are we just really poor relational communicators in the States?
Well, I think it's very good to have the research. I don't have any data about other countries. I know that the divorce rate in Canada is very similar to the divorce rate in the States, which is very scary because it's almost 50%. It's about 48 here. And from what I understand in your country, it's almost 50% now. So it's hard to stay together. But that research was done by a prof from Minnesota, if my memory serves me correctly. His name was, or is, Doherty. And his research was fascinating. I became acquainted with it at one of the conferences, a mediation conference of Academy of Professional Family Mediators. And he started discernment therapy, which is essentially, we as lawyers, we get involved beyond the point of reconciliation a lot of times. And his focus was, what can we do? What factors determine that people drift away? And perhaps we can actually bring these people, these couples together through this kind of discernment therapy so they can find a way to communicate to prevent the further breakup or breakdown, depending what you're looking at. But drifting apart, we try to bring them back together.
I see. We do have a few questions coming in. So Anita, Carol Benton says, in the spouse-to-spouse setting, wouldn't the prep focus be all three areas, not just emotional, but also physical and mental?
Mm-hmm. Well, of course. I mean, ultimately, when you go to prepare, whether you go to have this kitchen table negotiation or whether you go to a lawyer, you should be prepared mentally and emotionally and physically. What I was trying to do is to think about what has mattered in my experience, in my practice, when people actually fall apart and when they come and talk to me and say, I can't talk to her because he's always in the basement. When I start talking to him, he runs away. So I have to really, really prepare that wife to have this patience and have the understanding that the emotions will take over and how to control the emotions. So really a lot of this is about emotional intelligence and how you can gather all of this knowledge about emotions and use it to your advantage. But ultimately, of course, you will prep on three different, sort of from these three different perspectives. My sort of suggestion was, if you talk in this setting, perhaps this would matter most, because that's what I hear from the clients when they come to talk to me.
I would, you mentioned social intelligence, and that's something that I'd love to come back to in our second hour today. If there are ways that you actually teach your clients social intelligence at all, that would be interesting to know. We've got another question here from Sabu Imru. He or she says, I think lawyers learn how to interview and ask different types of questions. Do they also get trained in listening skills at university?
That would be the future. Okay, that's why I became interested in ILA, and that's why I did my CLP, because I believe there is a huge deficiency there. And no, lawyers are not, in my years when I was at law school in the 80s, there was not even a negotiation course being offered, no alternative dispute resolution courses. Even now, in many law schools, there are no regular dispute resolution courses being taught, which would have, of course, negotiation as a subcomponent of the course. We do get taught listening a little bit in a very cursory manner when it comes to mediation courses. So when you get certified as a mediator, yes, then you have a listening component in that kind of a course. But lawyers generally, no. That's why we are so well known for interrupting everybody.
Yeah, I was actually really surprised at the stat that you gave with lawyers interrupt on average in 7 seconds, because I know that physicians are 18 to 23 seconds, which I thought was bad, but you are so much worse, that's for sure. Catherine Black says, Anita, thank you very much. That was worth getting out of bed at 1:45 a.m. Australian time. I particularly like the way you framed the various scenarios with a linked prep, focus, goal, and strategy.
Well, thank you so much for being up.
And Luis Carlos Sotelo Castro, who I had lunch or breakfast with a few years ago at ILA, says, it seems to me that it's difficult to listen to accept in the courtroom. That is precisely the setting for opposing arguments. Can you expand on that idea?
On the idea of opposing arguments? I'm sorry, I got lost in the middle of the question.
Yeah. When we go to a courtroom, that's when we generally hear the opposing arguments. But you said that we should enter the courtroom willing to accept the judge's decision. So I guess we're talking two different time periods.
Right. That's why I needed a bit of a clarification, because of course I took it beyond the arguments of both parties, and what I was talking about just the judgment itself or the order, right? So that's when the judge speaks. But before that, what's really difficult is listening to what you really deeply do not accept, because this will be the other lawyer or the other spouse in that context, because I'm talking about family conflict, presenting some arguments that will be very much contra what you're saying. So whether it's, for example, a simple thing like that, I had a case that is now under appeal when the parents could not agree where the children were residing during the summer. Can you believe this as a parent? So we went before the judge, and the judge, my client, was claiming to have the kids over a certain period of weeks, and he was claiming that at that point he had the children. So listening for her to sit there and listen to the lawyer for the husband making submissions that the kids were with this husband of hers that of course she no longer cares for very much during that time. It was sort of like almost an absurd situation, because of course you cannot have the kids in two places at the same time. So that must have been very, very difficult to listen to. So there's preparation that goes into that, and I sit down with my clients and I do prepare them, whether it's mediation, whether it's going to chambers, whether it's going to trial. There's a long prep, because listening to something you're not accepting is extremely difficult, and your mind goes, you sort of like going into daydreaming mode, right? Or you're drifting away. And I, as a lawyer, I need my clients focused, because when I put the client on the stand, they have to know what has been said, so they should be listening very carefully. And it frequently does not happen, just like with the client and the 7-year-old boy who, the client who didn't write anything down. She couldn't remember what the judge said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can imagine, because when we get emotional, we get flooded, and then that makes listening impossible. Anita, we've got a question from ZSG who says, Anita, how do you find interest behind position?
By asking questions. So the typical example is, I want the house, right? And then you say, okay, well, what is it about the house that makes the house so important to you? So you ask the WH questions. My suggestion is always, and I do it myself too, actually do not ask the question with why, because that's frequently perceived as sort of opening up the doors you don't want to open, because what you really do want to do is you want to de-escalate conflict, and you want to learn about the values and about beliefs, because once we get to know that, the clients can then better enunciate what's important to them. And that's how we do make decisions. We make decisions based on our understanding of the situation, what's important to us as people who participate in this disagreement. So we have to talk about that. We have to say, what is it about the children's well-being? What is it about this particular activity? How would that be helpful to you? How would that help you move forward? So there are all these questions that will uncover what's important to the spouse. And we do it in mediation as well.
So I think you said the WH questions, is that right? So everyone except for why, who, what, where, when? Are those the WH questions?
Right, and mostly what. So
what?
To start, not to antagonize the parties and say, why are you saying that? Well, because I hate him. It's not about that. It's about what is it about this particular scenario? What is it about what you're proposing for access to your children that is important to you? Well, maybe I work at this time and I'm not able to go and pick up the little Johnny from school at this moment. But you know what? My mother can do it. Well, I hate mother-in-law, the other side will say. And we continue, well, what is it about that makes you say that? So we have to be very careful not to put any words in the mouths of the people, but to uncover what's important to them so they can actually come to that space and place where they can decide on their own. Because only those decisions that are made by the clients themselves are the ones that they will really, really honor in the future. And there's research to back that up.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Well, thank you, Anita. We're actually going to be moving on to Sheila, but we're going to come back to you as well. Sheila, if you would like to get prepared by sharing your screen.
All right.
Look, there you are.
Just 1 second. Oops, now I need to get back to the meeting.
That's a great plant behind you.
Oh, thank you. No. Okay. I had it all up, ready to go. So here we go.
Well, This is going to be Sheila Bentley. Sheila's got over 30 years of experience in the business of listening consulting on a range of listening, communication, and leadership topics. Her clients include places like Nike and FedEx and the New York Times, the Disney Store, Honeywell, Pfizer, U.S. Army and other government and nonprofit agencies. She's been an adjunct professor for 24 years at Arizona State University and another 20 years, I'm going to assume, not consecutively, but combined there with the University of Memphis. She's been with the ILA for over 30 years. She's a past president of the International Listening Association. And she actually is the person who was the brainchild behind the International Day of Listening, which she'll be talking about a little bit as well. So welcome, Sheila Bentley.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. And I'm just so delighted that we have people from all over the world who are interested in this topic. And I've just noticed that there's kind of a recurring theme. We're seeing it more in the media of, boy, we need to do some, take some different approaches to listening. So I think that's fabulous that we're finally making some inroads. You've gotten some wonderful techniques and tips from Anita, and I'm going to take a slightly different approach because I'm going to focus not so much on the results, but how we get to the results, because the results are, really what we want. And so I'm going to present a model to you in just a minute about a model that you can apply to a listening situation, and then assess how can I set this up in a better way, or how can I make sure that it's going to be more successful, that the outcomes will be. So before I get to that, how many of you have had this kind of a conversation? You're with someone that you want to discuss a controversial topic, and somebody says something, so you share your opinion, and the other person refutes it and states their opinion, and you refute that and restate a different opinion, and pretty soon there's more refuting, and maybe the voices get a little louder, and pretty soon there's some yelling, and then eventually we start attacking the other person rather than their ideas, and finally somebody pulls the pin on the conversational grenade and tosses it in, and it blows up, and now we're not speaking. So now not only did we not get the results that we wanted, but now we have a relationship problem as well. So this takes us to the quote I'm sure you've heard of Albert Einstein's: insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And I find it interesting that all the pictures of these very brilliant men, they all have wild hair. So I don't know if that's a requirement to being brilliant that you have wild hair, but anyway, I'm working on that. So here is the model. If we start with inputs, those inputs go into processes, and then those processes lead us to outcomes. And I want to use just an analogy that's a simple analogy, but it really fit this model. So I'm going to a dinner this evening, and I'm supposed to bring a dessert, and it's a Mediterranean Greek dinner, so I'm supposed to bring a Greek dessert. Well, the only Greek dessert I know of is baklava, and I'm not willing to take that on right away as my first Greek dessert. So I was talking to my daughter, and she said, "Oh, I have this great recipe for a lemon cake." And she said, "That's Mediterranean." So she sent me the recipe, but she said, I make some adjustments to it. So now we're talking about the inputs, all those ingredients that go into the recipe, and also my familiarity with baking and that sort of thing. So then you put those ingredients together in a certain way, and you get an outcome. And I've made the cake this morning, varying some of the ingredients. It required that you put it in a different pan, so I wasn't really sure how long to bake it. I wasn't sure what it was going to look like when I got out, so I wasn't really too sure what the outcome was going to be. And sometimes that's what our listening situations are like. Somebody brings up a topic and we go, "Oh, where's she going with that?" Or "Why did she bring that up right now?" So we're not sure what the outcome is. We're not sure what the input should be. We don't know what the processes should be. And so we kind of go into it blindly. So I'd kind of like to take you through this process using that analogy of, you start with some ingredients and you put them together in a certain way, and you want a particular outcome. And the more we can plan each of those, the better able we're going to be good listeners in that process. So let's start with the inputs. So the inputs include things like the participants. And one issue may be maybe you don't have the right participants in this conversation. It could be that the people who are participating are not the ones who can make the decision. So then it kind of becomes an exercise in arguing. And then it becomes sometimes an exercise in arguing to win. And if you can't win, then at least do damage. And that's, when we pull the pin on that grenade and throw it in. So it may be that you need to get different participants having this conversation or involve some other people in it. Maybe you need to bring somebody like Anita in, a mediator, or even just somebody who can serve as a referee and make sure that people are sort of, staying on track, that they're dealing just with the issue that you have defined or that you want to talk about. But a referee sometimes, or just a third party who kind of mediates or observes what's going on and can kind of help you through some rough spots. Past history, anybody in education or behavioral sciences has heard that, past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. So probably whatever you have done in the past is going to be what you do in the future. And so if that's the case, then maybe we want to identify what are the things that have caused us problems in the past that we can change. And Anita mentioned environment, but I'd like to mention it in just a slightly different way, because the environment is important. For instance, if you're in a business setting whoever's turf you're on controls the environment of that conversation. So they are the ones who decide whether they will answer the phone when their phone rings, or whether somebody can interrupt in the office, or whether it's too hot in the room, or, anyway, they control the environment. So if it's a particularly difficult conversation, you might want to find a neutral place to have the conversation, somewhere that you both have equal opportunity to sort of control the environment or to make adjustments in the environment. Some other things that we can look at are those habits. So for instance, maybe it is that you have a tendency to bring the difficult issues up at the dinner table. You always bring it up at the dinner table, and then sometimes it doesn't work out well, so now you've ruined dinner. Or you bring it up just before you go to bed. Or maybe you wait until you get in the car, and so you have a captive audience and they can't escape. So it could be that some of the habits that you have about how you approach the conversation may be setting it up to not be a successful conversation. And you certainly want to consider the current situation. Is there something else that's going on besides whatever has happened in the past? For instance, whenever there is a school violence, a school shooting, it changes the conversation about gun safety and about violence in our culture. And if we don't recognize that and don't deal with that current situation as well, if we don't make some kind of adjustments in the conversation that we're going to have, or it could be that, there was, you need to apologize. Maybe the current situation requires that you start with an apology before you even try to talk about a problem. And then rules and procedures, excuse me. Sometimes there are particular rules. I mean, it could be something as simple as your agenda, or that you follow Robert's rules in a discussion. But also there are certain types of meetings, like I'm on a commission here in the town that I live in, and we have to follow the sunshine laws. So we cannot make decisions or have conversations anywhere except in a public meeting, so that the public is privy to whatever discussions have gone on and how we arrived at the decision. But it could be that you want to establish some rules. If you haven't had an agenda in the past, maybe you need an agenda. And then we're going to get to all those things that make a difference in how people participate. And these are also inputs, things like personalities. We've all had to deal with that person who has the argumentative personality. No matter what you say, they're going to take issue with it. And then you can disagree with that and they'll take issue with that. Or you can agree with them and they'll take issue with even the fact that you agreed with them. So anyway, that constant arguing. Then all kinds of other inputs, such as differences in communication style, cultural, age, gender, and regional differences. We know that the ways that people listen and the expectations that they have in listening vary in all of those areas. Nonverbal communication differs very much that's a big cultural difference, whether we make eye contact, whether we nod our heads, whether we respond back. And I always like to share this one because I think it's kind of a fun example, and that's a regional difference. In the South, children are raised to say yes, ma'am, and yes, sir, when they're listening to somebody who's older, to another parent or another adult. Anyway, they are raised to say yes, ma'am, and yes, sir. And that shows that not only are they listening, but it's also a sign of respect. However, in the Northeast, yes, ma'am, and yes, sir are only used sarcastically. That's in the United States. And so if you say yes, ma'am, or yes, sir to somebody in the Northeast, you're likely to get don't yes, ma'am me, because they think that you're being sarcastic with it and not showing respect. So you just want to take a look at what might some of those differences be, and what kinds of adjustments do you need to make, or do you need to learn about some of the differences so that you're ready for some of those differences. And then sometimes there are required outcomes. And Anita kind of mentioned some of those, like maybe you're required to make a decision after this discussion, whether it's, child custody, or, whether you're going to buy the house or not. But, in some instances, we have to make a decision, and that's going to affect the inputs that we have. And I'll ask for your input on inputs when we finish with this. But think about if you can think of any other examples of inputs, things that are on the front end of the conversation that affect the processes and the outcomes. So hold that thought, and let's go on to the next one. So now we're going to look at the processes. And so this is, you know, my recipe analogy. This is how I take those ingredients and I put them together, and, you know, how small does the lemon zest have to be, and how much do I mix it, and how full the pan, you know, and how long do I bake it? Those are all part of the processes. And how often do we go into this conversation? We start it the usual way. Maybe we say something like, you make me mad when you do this, which of course is an attack. And so you're probably going to get a counterattack. So we start the usual way with the usual people, and we have the expectation for the usual outcome. I know this is not going to go well, but I'm going to do it anyway. And so we go right into some of those regular behaviors. And we get into the habits of following those past behaviors. And then we're back to Albert Einstein's insanity, because we're thinking we're going to get a different outcome when we really aren't. Again, we talked about following required or established rules and processes. Make sure everybody knows if there are required rules that you need to follow, or if you're going to set some up for this conversation. We're not, as Anita suggested, we're not going to interrupt. We are going to echo each other to make sure that we've understood. We're going to stay on this topic. We're not going to bring up the other things that happened 10 years ago and so on. So it could be that we're going to set a new starting point. So instead of we're going to start at this point in the conversation, maybe we're going to back up and have a conversation about how we're going to have the conversation, rather than just jumping right into the conversation. This is what I like to start with, and that's to ask each person to define the problem. And sometimes I like to have them not only define the problem, but also to suggest what they think is the solution. Because it's so interesting how often we don't define the problem the same way. And if you're not defining the problem the same way, you're probably not going to agree on what the solution is. So make sure that you have defined the problem and that you've limited it, and we're only going to talk about this issue or this problem, and we'll save those others for another conversation. And then it's a good idea to establish a desired outcome. Do we want to try to solve this problem, or maybe we just want to maybe we just want to maintain a healthy relationship in this conversation. But what is it that we want to try to do? Set that at the beginning, at the beginning of your conversation, so it's part of the process. I like to frame the conversation. So you're going to put a frame around it. This is where we're going to start. This is what we're going to achieve. This is what we want to achieve. Here's the procedure. Here's how we're going to go about it. And here are some rules. And we're going to stick within this framework for the conversation. And then put a big star by the last one, because that's really such a significant one. If you ask them for their input first and listen first, they are more likely to listen to you, because we have a tendency to give back what we get. So if you do a great job of listening to them, they are more likely to do a great job of listening to you. But if you launch in with your opinion and it's very, very assertive or aggressive, and you throw in a lot of, the most and the best or the worst, or, those qualifiers that make it a win-lose situation, you're probably going to get kind of a win-lose outcome. So ask first and listen first, and I think you'll be pleased with the results that you get. So now let's move to the outcomes. We oftentimes start with the outcome that we want is to solve the problem. And even salespeople will tell you oftentimes can't make the sale in the first conversation. So sometimes the outcome that you should want is to establish a relationship so that you then can discuss the problem. Or we're not going to solve the problem, but we're going to make sure that we have narrowed it down to something that we can deal with. So set a new desired outcome if you need to. If you've had that conversation multiple times and it hasn't gone anywhere, try setting a different desired outcome during the processes. One that's an important one for the conversation is an outcome could be that we're not going to try to solve the problem. We're just going to try to understand each other. So my goal in this conversation is to simply understand what your position is, what your perspective of this topic is, and vice versa. Or it could be that we are going to follow some rules that will enable us to improve the relationship so that we have a desire to want to solve the problem together rather than making it a win-lose outcome. It should never be about winning the argument. It should be about solving the problem. And if you can't solve that problem, then find one that you can solve so that you're moving forward. Okay, And then, as Anita suggested, there are several things that you can do in terms of establishing a process for discussing when participants disagree. And she mentioned some of the really big ones, things like not interrupting. I also like two others. One, to echo the other person. And when the other person makes a suggestion, don't find what's wrong with it. Start with what's right with that. So I use talking chips and I hear you chips, and I have one that's a thumbs up chip. And when we're talking about solutions, you have to start with the thumbs up one. So I have to find something that's good about your solution. Even if it's only this big, it's something that's good, because it might be that we need to include that in part of the outcome, in part of our solution. But if we shoot it down and if we take it off the table because it has something wrong with it, then we don't get the benefit of what that solution could offer. Okay, let me ask Laura and Phil how you want to, I want to open it up for questions, but I think we are, kind of at the end of the time. And I also want to make a little announcement about the International Day of Listening. So you tell me how you'd like to move forward right now.
Terrific. Well, Sheila, right now we do have one question in the chat room, or actually one comment in the chat room. And then I think we should do, let's wait for the IDL until we come back from break, because
Okay.
that's when we can do Vancouver as well. But Catherine Black, who is up in the middle of the night in Australia, says, this is resonating from my conversations and arguments with my articulate teenage son. So thank you. So let's do this then. Let me double check my time. I have 6 minutes after the hour. Let's just take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we can have Vancouver and then IDL, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So those of you who have been sending questions into chat, we'll unmute your microphone so you can actually talk to the presenters today and ask them specific questions and get feedback.
Okay.
One last piece of feedback, Sheila, from Sabu. Sheila, thank you very much for these excellent insights into the process and framework for a fruitful conversation.
Thank you. And in case somebody has to leave, may I just mention that next Thursday is International Day of Listening. And I will talk about that a little bit, about how you can participate and that sort of thing. But I just really want to invite all of you to take what you've learned today and do something with it next Thursday and participate in International Day of Listening. Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Sheila, if you can unshare the screen, that would be terrific. I have 7 after the hour. We'll come back at 12 after the hour.
Okay, great.
To record again?
Okay.
And do you want me to answer that question?
Yeah, I do. Welcome back to our webinar. We just heard from Sheila Bentley, and Sheila actually has a question that came into her. Sheila, do you want to read the question and maybe give us your response to it?
Sure. The question is from ZSG, and it's, if you want to get better outcomes, what if your opponent disagrees with your opinion? And isn't that kind of the case for so many of our disagreements, that we don't agree on what the outcome is, or sometimes we can't even agree on what the problem is. So I think one of Anita's suggestions of asking what is it about that problem that is most important to you? But also I think another thing is to look at, what do we find agreement on? Because sometimes we get so focused on what we disagree about that we don't realize that there's a whole lot of overlap in what we agree on. I know that, religion is a lot of the basis for some disagreements. And I think they did a study through appreciative inquiry and found that something like 95% of all of the tenets of religion, of the world's religions, are the same. So we agree on 95% of religion, and yet, we've seen wars about religion and the particular beliefs. So, I think if you can start by, as I said, identify what the problem is, and I like for people to state what the solution is, what they think is the solution, and then maybe examine what's right with that solution, and then, and if you start with that, they will stay much more open to your solution as well, much more open to finding something that they can agree on. if you shoot it down, then they're going to do that back to you. So you want to stop the shoot down their opinion or their solution. But what part of that, is there some part of that solution that you could agree to? And if not, sometimes what it is that we have to agree to disagree, and we're not going to keep bringing this up. But now we have to find a way that we can coexist with whatever that problem is. So what can we do so that we can both continue to live in this, occupy this workspace or home space or whatever, and and have a positive relationship? Because if you focus too much on that, sometimes it can just kind of take over everything. Did that answer that?
I think that answers it.
Okay.
We will hear soon if it did not. I did want to add that one of the things that you said that really resonated with me, Sheila, was sometimes you can just have a conversation where you say, my goal is just to understand your side of this. We're not going to solve it today. I just want to understand it, and I want you to understand my side too. I would think that would, we have to be on there, because I know that it's a very different conversation when you do that. Very different.
Yeah. Very different, because there's some information on the website that we've listed bad habits for listening when you disagree and some good habits for listening. And one of the bad habits is never finding out what the other side's opinion is or finding out the facts of the other side. So I have a book group, and our activity for International Day of Listening is going to be that we're going to talk about, controversial topic, and we have to come prepared to present the other side's view. So you have to do some research and find out, well, what does the other side think? Because I think, most of the time we don't bother to do that. We're just, whatever they say, we're going to disagree with it. So we have to come prepared to present the other side, and then in the discussion we can take our own whatever our perspective is, but we've had to do the research so that we understand where they're coming.
That makes perfect sense. We actually have a question from Lewis, and he wants to come live and ask the question, and if anybody else wants to come live, just put it in the chat box and we'll have Phil unmute you. Lewis, are you there?
Yes,
Hi,
I'm here. Thank you. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Laura, for facilitating, and thank you, Sheila. I'm enjoying everything. And the question is, because the model that Sheila is presenting, it seems to me to be like, I will use this term, please correct me if it's wrong, but I think it's very cognitive. It's like very, how do you say, analytical, it's fine, but I don't see the role of emotions in there. So for instance, in disagreements, and in particular in families, very often it's about someone is hurt and feels like something was really wrong. And then perhaps the process of the conversation, one part discloses emotions that for the other are, a revelation for the first time. Say someone says, I was cheating to you. Or someone says, I felt so bad when you said this thing, and I think you are horrible for that and that thing. So it's then the person who's listening needs to have a kind of training in dealing with these kind of disclosures. So how do you see that fitting within your model, or how can you respond to that aspect of emotions within your model?
Well, that's a great question, because, the emotions that we have are one of those inputs. And if we don't recognize that there's some hurt feelings or some anger, that sort of thing on the front end, then we may not be dealing with that in the process. As I mentioned, sometimes the very first thing that has to come out of your mouth is an apology. I'm sorry that I hurt you. I'm sorry that I said that. I was angry. But another thing that you can do in the process, if you find that, your shoulders are coming up and your jaw is clenching and your blood pressure is going up, and you're getting upset, sometimes it's a great thing to just take a break, call for a timeout, take a break, because your system is full of what's the adrenaline. And you have to dissipate that, because now you're in the fight or flight mode. So you're ready to, fight or leave. And so we need to take a break and let that adrenaline dissipate so that we can then come back and more rationally talk about it. But the other thing is that when there's a lot of emotion, I used to teach this a lot in seminars, if there's strong emotion being expressed, recognize and echo the emotion. I see that you're really angry about this. I can tell that this has really hurt you. So recognize the emotion, label it, and then you can talk about what you're going to do about that emotion. But if we go strictly to repeating what they've said and we don't recognize and we don't echo the emotion, we really haven't gotten the important part of the message. Sometimes the emotion is the most important part. I want you to know that I'm mad. I want you to recognize that, or that I'm hurt, and show empathy, etc. But recognizing and naming the emotion is a big part of it. At least now you see that it's out there on the table, so we can deal with the fact that you're mad or that you're hurt. That's part of the problem that we have to address.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Perfect. Sheila, since we've got your screen up, why don't you go ahead and tell us about IDL, and then we'll switch back to Anita to talk about Vancouver, and then we will open it up for all Q&A.
Okay, so let me go back to this one. Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay. So I just want to invite you to the International Day of Listening. It's next Thursday, so we have less than 7 days. Our theme this year is Listen Even When You Disagree, and that's kind of where this webinar came from, because we were talking about it and we said, wow, that would be a really good thing to do as a webinar and help people prepare for International Day of Listening. So what we are doing in the IDL is we are promoting listening cafes all over the world. So we're suggesting that you host a listening cafe. And what that is, it's just an informal conversation. It can involve beverages or food or whatever, but it doesn't have to. But it's an informal setting where we're going to have this discussion. And you'll see that on our website, there are lots of how-tos, there are guides, there are handouts, there's posters. There's one packet that's called a participant's guide, and it's kind of got, everything that you would need. If you download that and look at that, it tells you how to host the listening cafe, and it gives you some of the handouts that you'll need and so on. There's also a list of scheduled activities on the website, so people who already have something scheduled have shared that on the website, so you can get some ideas about what to do. Corinne Jansen in the Netherlands, they just took it and ran. The whole country is celebrating, and it's not International Day of Listening. They're celebrating the entire month of September. So, and they're doing all kinds of things in a variety of situations and environments and so on. So here's how to participate. You're going to choose a topic, and then you're going to invite people to talk about it. And it could be that you invite the people first and then say, we'd like to practice this and learn how to do this. So what's a controversial topic that we could talk about? Then you'll organize your event, such as a listening cafe. And then again, you can go to the website for that list of bad and good habits for listening when you disagree. I think that if you just even pass that out so that people can see what they shouldn't do and what they should do when there's disagreement. I think something as simple as that will help. And there's our website there. You'll find all kinds of really good information. Jean-Francois, who is from Switzerland, has done a terrific job of putting lots of very valuable, useful, hands-on kinds of information on the IDL website this year.
Thanks.
And I just want to, again, invite all of you to please participate and share how you're participating.
Yeah, thanks, Sheila. And actually, I wanted to share a few things that I'm doing because I know that when you invite people to participate, oftentimes they kind of get overwhelmed and they don't know what to do, or they don't have time to invite people together. So there are a number of different optional ways to do it as well. So for example, next week I invited 9 people to meet me at a restaurant, and we're going to have a listening cafe at the restaurant. So that way I don't have to host it in my home, but we're all going out. And of course, we'll have the rule that nobody's allowed to have their cell phone on. And I'll probably pass out some of those handouts on, what not to say when you disagree or things like that. But it's just a great time to get together. And then my students sometimes choose to do things individually. So for example, they've learned different listening strategies in class for how you can listen cognitively when you're in a lecture situation. So they might choose to apply that all next week in a class that they're in. and then they can just tell me how that goes. Or one of my favorite suggestions, Sheila, and this one actually comes from you. I remember a few years ago you saying that you were frustrated with your children because they only called you when they were driving somewhere. And you thought, well, am I not important enough for you to just sit down and have a conversation with me? And so one of the things that I recommend to my students is that they call their mother or father or a loved one, maybe a grandparent, and they actually have a conversation without multitasking. And so I do that with my mother too. So thank you very much for giving us that. Let's see, we're going back to Anita. Anita, can you share your screen to give us a little preview of our conference next year, which is going to be in Vancouver, Canada? I'm very excited about that.
Well, I'm delighted to hear it. So what I want to do first is invite you to Vancouver, literally. If I could take you onto a little plane. Imagine we are boarding this plane together right now, and we are going to fly over the place where we are going to meet. So let me see if the technology cooperates. Are you ready for the flight? Yeah. Okay, let's do it. It's very brief. Here we go. Okay, so is it on? See?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, here we go. So I will tell you where. Oh, you see, the tower on the left is our place, the round tower. Oh, sorry. Okay, so now I would like all of you to look at the pink tower. Can you see the circle, the one that is being circled? You see the mouse run, now I'm pointing to it, the red tower. Yes, that's where we are going to be. Not necessarily there, right there on the roof, but in that building. So that's the building. You can see how close we'll be to the ocean. So that's one. Now this is going to end now. And what I'd like to say is, let's just get me back to yeah, here is what we put for the listening post. So hopefully, listening. No, this is for the no, the website, the conference website, right? No? Okay, here we go. My assistant and I are having different views here, but look at this beautiful picture. Okay, this is again the dates and where, and let me just say a few things so I can get organized before I show you the actual brochure. So the conference will be taking place in March, and this will be the third week of March, so March 21st, 22nd, and 23rd. That's Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. We are going to start in the afternoon of Wednesday. We have enough interest, and we'll have an informal gathering on Wednesday evening. Before we start, I would like very much to invite and honor all of the colleagues and your friends and acquaintances who have not yet been at any of these conferences. I imagine these people must exist somewhere in the world. So please do come to the convention. So the first-time attendees will be honored. There is a call for papers that now is on the website, listen.org. If you go to the conference website, there's a link for call for papers. The submissions, different formats you will see in the submission form. We would love to see the Pecha Kucha submissions. We would love to see the TED-like talks. I would like to see a lot of variety. And the theme of the convention is listening to conflict. So that will be the focus. If we get a lot of submissions about how to listen to conflict in a competent way, perhaps we can make the world a better place and introduce more peace, not only in the families, but in many different settings as well. I think that's it in terms of the information about the date and where. So let me just show you the brochure that is on the website. And this is the one that shows you now the exact, just a moment, it's going to be just coming up. So if you go to listen.org and you go to the convention link, what you will see is this picture, the invitation for you to join us. In Vancouver, you have the theme, the website, all of the information here, and then on the date. And then on the second page, you will find information about the actual building. So as you see, the pink tower from the quick video, that's our venue. It's at Simon Fraser University downtown campus. You will find information about how inexpensive it's going to be to all of you, the American colleagues, to come to my country, because our dollar is, well, it sucks. It's not very good in comparison to the British pound in particular, or the American dollar. Or Australian dollar, I suppose, as well. Yes, there we go. So it's not going to be super expensive. Hopefully Vancouver will greet us all with these beautiful cherry blossoms. They are to be expected in March. There might be a little bit of rain, who knows? Come prepared. We are right downtown, not too far from the water, as you saw, and there are lots of different restaurants, venues to eat, and I hope we can all get together and have a very successful convention. So thank you for listening to that bit.
Terrific. Thank you, Anita. Anita, if you want to stop your screen share so everybody can unmute their microphone, I do want to say that Lewis wanted to know if we get to ride in the airplane if we come to Vancouver.
If we can get to ride in an airplane, well, not only a big one, because when you're landing, actually see the whole city, but there are also hydroplanes, and they are really cool. You can go on a 60-minute flight, or probably even shorter, and you take off from the water in the bay, and you can actually land in the bay. This is so cool. I did it once years ago. I was super scared. It was one of these tests, in life, when we subject ourselves, this is a spider, I'm so afraid, but I put it here, right? There was one of these tests, and I did pass. Look at me, I'm alive. So yeah, it's safe, and it's a lot of fun.
That's terrific. How many people can ride in that plane?
Well, probably from what I recall, around 10, or maybe something like that. It was many years ago. So it's not a big plane, and it looks, it's just like Santa Claus coming on a sleigh, It's, you walk, you get to the water, and you slide on it. It's like, for you people in the south of the United States, or somewhere in beautiful Australia, or somewhere, when you go, the water skiing and boarding and surfing, it's kind of that sense that you're hitting the water, but you're safe. It's awesome.
That's terrific. Well, Lewis, if you come, I will go on the plane ride with you.
Oh, fantastic. That's a plan, Dan. That's a plan.
Anita, we actually have a couple people who didn't unmute, but they've sent in questions. Carol Benton wants to know the deadline for presentations for the conference.
The deadline for presentations for the conference right now, I believe you'll have to check on the website. I believe it's the end of October. We wanted to keep a deadline pretty close. The first one is November the 1st at 11:59 p.m. Pacific time. And that will be the one for the workshops. Because in addition to Pecha Kucha and TED Talks and the old-fashioned presentations, lecture type, we also would like to welcome some workshops, so longer presentations that will be interactive. And we would like to see how many submissions we'll get for those. So that deadline will be on November the 1st. And then the deadline for all of the other proposals will be November 15th.
Terrific. Thank you for that. And Catherine Black, still awake in the middle of the night in Australia, says, I don't know what's more appealing, the idea of visiting Vancouver with cherry blossoms or coming to an international conference focused on listening.
Well, the answer is very clear, and it says BOTH.
So we will have cherry blossoms in March.
I cannot promise. I don't live in BC, unfortunately, even though Laura put me in Vancouver, but I'm not. I'm on the other side of the beautiful Rocky Mountains. So the picture at the end when I was thanking you for your attention, that's one of the lakes in the Rockies in Canada. But I live on the other side, unfortunately, of the beautiful British Columbia. So we should expect maybe a little bit of rain, not very much, but the flowers will be, definitely there will be some flowers, and some trees may have flowers on them as well. And there are beautiful gardens, we'll have things to do, so there's still plenty of time. Any questions, please don't hesitate to contact myself. Of course, there's a lot of information about Vancouver tourism website. So I'm sure we'll have a very, very good time together.
Absolutely. Louis wants to know if Sheila's model is written or described somewhere.
That's a darn good question. Not that I remember where it came from. Some of it I've put together myself, but and I'm happy to send you the overheads if you'd like.
Thank you. Yeah, very good. Thank you.
And I see something, if I may just interject quickly, desde Colombia, de Juliana, muchísimas gracias, saludos, estaré bienvenida, veo, muchas gracias. It was just a little bit of gibberish because one of our colleagues from Colombia just said welcome, so I just wanted to greet her. So thank you so much for being on the call.
Terrific, thanks for doing that. Speaking of which, do we have anybody on the call who speaks Russian?
Besides Anita. Не говорю по-русски. My Russian is so limited right now. Не говорю. Spanish is my love. So Spanish is the language I absolutely love. Other than my native language that is extremely emotional. So English is the driest language on the planet. I don't know how you people make laugh. Because in Spanish, you can describe a lot of things. In Polish, you can describe a lot of feelings. In English, you say, I love you. Okay. There will be education on that subject in Vancouver. Just kidding.
Yeah. Anita, I wanted to go back to that idea of social intelligence. You were talking about listening requiring a lot of social intelligence. And I was wondering if you teach your clients social intelligence or any types of skills in social intelligence, and if so, how you go about doing that.
Well, it's not so much because I'm mostly practicing the area of family law. So as Luis was saying, emotions actually play a paramount role when people discuss something that matters to them a lot. So it's not so much social intelligence, it's mostly emotional intelligence. And within that concept, what really is important is the way we manage our emotions when we talk about subjects that matter a lot. So what Sheila was saying as well, and I agree with that 100% because it actually does happen in real life in meetings with the clients. The naming of the emotion, there is ample research from neuroscience, another subject that I'm obsessed with. And it does say that when we actually name the emotion, all these amazing reactions, electrical, chemical reactions in our brains happen, and our body relaxes, the hormones flow differently. It is amazing what happens when you actually say it to somebody. And somebody who is in a position of, like myself, for example, when I'm mediating, and I have to be composed. So there's a lot of self-awareness involved in that. I do speak to my clients about that. I do talk to them a little bit about the brain science to prepare them and to make them aware also that the conflict that a lot of times they escalate at home is extremely destructive to their children. And there's, again, ample research from Harvard and from other universities that points to the very, very detrimental impact of the parental conflict, not only on the health of the children in general, or on the, let's say, emotional health. It's actually having impact on the way the brain develops. So we are talking about very young children, and it's extremely sobering. Quite a few times you would have a client look at this and think about this, and people cry because they do not realize how extremely destructive what they do at home can be to their own children. So it's about self-awareness, it's about management of emotions, and it's about relationships and how to maintain them, and how to maintain them in a way that will not be destructive to the family. And the focus must be on the future. Because a lot of times people go back to the past, and the past is in the past. So it's, you know, it's informative in a lot of ways in different areas. But when it comes to family conflict, really the focus must be on the future and what's best for the children if they're involved.
Well, actually, that leads me to another question, Anita. Is there any conflict where the focus should be on the past?
Is there any conflict? Well, of course. I mean, for example, you can take any kind of commercial conflict, right? When we have different financial statements, information about companies, and we have all of these numbers that indicate profits, and they should be reflected and reviewed and discussed when there's some planning for the future. So there may be conflict because there may have been embezzlement, there may have been fraud in the past. So yes, the past information may be also important. But my focus is really on families who have kids, and parents. So it's mostly what I've presented, what I've talked about was using the lens of parenting. So it's a different side of it. And as I said at the beginning, conflict is really multifaceted. We cannot just say we are looking just at the numbers unless you have perhaps two, you know, businesses and there's a dispute. But even then, businesses don't speak. It's the representatives, it's the people who actually come and talk. And they are also driven by emotion. And there's fascinating research from the area of decision making, a new sort of area of research altogether, that that research does confirm that we cannot make we cannot make a decision just in a rational way. When I was in law school, we were taught to be rational, and we have to make rational decisions. Well, forget that. We are human, we have our emotions, and we are driven by them. And there are no 100% rational decisions, because emotions always play a role in the decision-making process.
And if I could just add a tag on to that, your question about, you know, conflict in the past. Oftentimes people keep bringing up the past because they want to establish blame. And if I can establish that this conflict is your fault, then I don't have to change. You're the one that has to change. But, you know, that typically doesn't solve the conflict going forward. So sometimes I tell people, you know, let's forget about the past, because it doesn't really matter whose fault it was in the past. That's done. Now, what are we going to do differently going forward? So what do you need to be done differently? What do you need? What can we agree on? And that sort of thing. But I think a lot of the discussions, and as Anita said, particularly when there are businesses involved, we're trying to establish blame because maybe there's going to be, you know, a financial cost because you're to blame. So, you know, that's more important in business to establish blame, I think, than it is in a personal conflict.
Yeah, that's interesting, Sheila. I can think of a number of arguments, particularly when I was younger, that I wanted to establish blame as opposed to look forward. So, you know, listening and learning how to listen and all of these webinars and the education that I get is just so helpful. That's for sure. Louis, I see that you had a question for us.
Yes, it was I think for both of the presenters about labeling or naming the emotions, because Anita was saying that it's important to label the emotions, but I can imagine situations in which the label that I use causes more problems. So basically my question is, who names and who labels? And perhaps if part of the technique is to perhaps before naming it, saying or doing what Sheila said, which was echoing, which is, okay, you use this word, you said you were frustrated. Does that mean that you do feel very frustrated? So before, my question is whether before labeling, we should echo or something like that, you know, how to take care in the process of labeling. Does that make sense?
It depends on the context. So, for example, if in the process of becoming a mediator, you have to learn certain techniques. And one of them is reframing. And when we are reframing in mediation, we are taught how to recognize the emotions. And here is the impact of the face. And Laura knows that because I remember I talked to Laura about the facial analysis, what is it, FACS system?
Yes, FACS, facial action coding system by
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and I personally am fascinated with the face. Went to a congress about facial recognition of emotions in Porto. There's one coming up in October now. They're holding the second one. So we have to study the face and micro emotions in the face. And some mediators are better, some are less skilled at that. But we have several emotions that are really almost palpable in the room when we are observing people who are interacting and they are very, very strongly disagreeing on the subject. You can tell, you can just sense that as a human being. Why? Because we have mirror neurons. So there's this mirroring as well, and neuroscience tells us that it's not conscious. We are being informed what is going on by our own body. So we have to learn how to recognize the emotion. So that's in that training in the mediation world. Now, when you're on one-to-one, just with your spouse, that I guess depends on your own world knowledge, your experience, and your own wisdom, how to do that. I think just checking into it, saying, are you upset? What do you think the person will say? Well, of course I am. Or maybe it will be, no, I'm not. What are you implying? So you have to be very careful when you're checking in, because it may lead to much more sort of explosive discussion after. So I think the way to approach it would be to pose it in a question, but in a question that will be very polite. So I'm listening, for example, I'm listening to you speak about this subject, and I'm getting a sense that you may be really frustrated right now. And I see a tear coming down. So it tells me that you may be even very sad about this. Please tell me, am I getting that right? Or if not, please let me know what it is that you're feeling. So, if you're putting the question in this way, it's an inquiry, but it's a gentle inquiry. And you're not naming the emotion in a way that will label it for everybody in the room, because you really don't know. I don't know. We never really 100% know. So it's sort of like an escapade, trying to recognize the pieces of the puzzle. You don't see the whole, you don't have all of the pieces in your world. In your hand, sorry, but you do want to put them together to create some sort of a meaningful whole, some sort of you have to attach the meaning to what you're seeing. But going about it has to be very subtle. So that kind of inquiry is helpful, but not naming the emotion in that sort of very, yeah, I see you're crying now, so here's the Kleenex. That's not going to help. Although I do pass Kleenex regularly, yes.
And if I
would you like to add, please?
I'm sorry?
Would you like to add to this, please?
Yeah, if you don't mind. And this comes from Helen Meldrum, because I remember attending one of her sessions, was on listening in the medical healthcare field. And she said that if doctors can label the emotion, and she said there are only 4, mad, sad, glad, and scared, that if doctors label the emotion that they're seeing in their patient, that the patient will tell them how to fix it. So, if there's a big difference in if you're mad about something than if you're afraid of something. And so, if you label it, and I think sometimes some of those come out the same way. They all look mad, sometimes scared looks mad. So anyway, I just thought that was interesting, that if the doctor labels the emotion, that the patient will tell them how to fix that emotion, or, whatever it is. So I don't know, maybe that's different and maybe it's different in different fields, how you apply it. But, oftentimes doctors don't examine the emotion that you're feeling. That's not a symptom of the disease, or, that's something else. So we don't need to deal with that, but apparently they do.
Interesting. Who else out there has a question or just a comment?
Edie looks like she has a question.
No, but
You are unmuted by host. Okay. When you were talking about doctors being able to read the emotion, my mother would complain. They never look at me. They are now behind the computer screen. And we were at a business convention of my husband, And they are now having extreme difficulty in the banking business because there is no interaction, no eye contact. You know, it's just click on the computer, take care of everything. You don't have to look at anybody, hide behind this screen. Well, that's not a good way to listen. And I wanted to make a comment to Anita, since she's Polish. I read an article about Mitzi Gaynor, who a longtime movie star, and she said when she would just get so frustrated and her emotions were just at a bubbling point, she said it sounded so awful. It sounded like she was cussing a blue streak. She said, just say 77 in Polish. She said, it's awful sounding. So, do you know 77 in Polish, Anita?
I can say, just Edie, please listen. In my native tongue, it will sound like this. 77.
That sounds pretty bad.
That sounds pretty bad, right? But you know, speaking the foreign language and talking about emotions, that's an area of inquiry in itself. How incredibly stressful it is to speak the other language. Right now, I'm looking at you, and I know that there's colleagues on the call who do not speak English as the first language, and I'm sort of at ease with that. But then I'm looking at Phil's inquisitive look, I'm looking at Laura's face, I'm looking at my mentor, Dick Haley here, and you know, I'm looking at these people who actually have English, American English as their first language, and my tongue is being twisted here and there because I may be mispronouncing a sound or so. It's an incredible amount of stress to actually do it in a foreign language. And I understand that when the clients come to see me and they speak the native language to me, their native language, how much more relaxed the bodies will be, that they can explain the emotion in their language. Because talking about emotion, and I can ask Luis and Juliana if they would agree, in Espanol, when we talk about emotions, I think we have many more words than in English. Would you agree with that, Luis? In general, in interactions?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I have not counted them. But,
okay, let's count them together then. Okay, it's just something we feel, right, in terms of descriptive words. And I know in my native tongue, we can call one person so many different names because we can play with the actual name. My son's name is Adrian, and I can say it in Polish. It's Adrianek, Adrianusz, Adrianeczek, Adriasiunek, Adrian. It's just, you can hear different. In English, it's Adrian. Oh, sorry, Adrian. And I say, I'm not Anita. So the school teacher was saying, you know, well, it's Adrian. I said, no, it's not Adrian. It's just Adrian. It's like Adrian. And, you know, it's the same name, but look at the pronunciation and it really becomes a completely different word. So that's a very interesting area of research. And I have a question for the professors on the call right now, particularly the ones who are facilitating this. I'm curious if you're aware of any research that will deal with listening and people who speak more than one language. So not bilingual, but people who speak two foreign languages. If there's any research on that, listening and conversations, communication in foreign languages involving more than one foreign.
There is a lot of research in certain areas. So for example, one of the things that I'm currently studying are metacognitive listening strategies. And metacognitive listening strategies are strategies that we develop to listen to the language that's incoming. They were developed primarily, though, to teach a second language. So when one is learning a second language, how do I learn to listen to that second language? I also remember walking around at an ILA conference once with Marguerite Imhoff, and she had just come from another conference, and she said, you'll like this, Anita, because it talks about the brain, that when individuals learn the second language before the age of 12, their brain fires the same way in both languages, but if they learn the second language after the age of 12, it fires in different ways. So I imagine that that might point to translation issues that are going on. particularly until somebody becomes comfortable in that second language.
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting. It would be interesting to hear or to read some research about, the firing in the second or the third language, if it's so different, really, because I think your implication or your suggestion is it will be different, will be recognized by the native speakers as, not the sounds of their language per se. But yet, I think there are a lot of different, depending on the roots of the language, it's a fascinating conversation. Because this is not for this call, but when we see one another in Vancouver, we can share some stories about, second language or third language and what happens when we speak it. And, when I travel, I always ask the people to put me on the map if they say, where are you from? Because of my accent. And they put me on the map in so many different places that I laugh. How did you get Switzerland? I was from
I'm curious, what language do you think in? Because that's a significant question. Once you can think in the other language, then, you're almost like a native speaker. But what language do you think in?
I don't think that I think in a language. I think we think in images. I think it's something that I cannot verbalize. But when I actually get to the point when I'm able to understand what I have to put on paper, it depends on the need. So most of the time, because I live in Canada, it comes in English. But I do love Spanish. So a lot of times when I'm in a Spanish-speaking country, I would just react right away and think that I think in that language. But I don't think it's not a conscious reasoning. It really isn't, because we are not aware a lot of times what's going on in our mind, and we have our biases and they're unconscious. So there's so much more when it comes to how we decide to resolve disagreements. There are so many factors in play, so many factors at play. Other than what we've talked about, you, Sheila, and I, we just barely, sort of tried to scratch the surface. We can look at it from so many different angles. It's a fascinating conversation. I hope to continue it in Vancouver and bring experience from other people.
Yeah, when you said that you think in images, that's why you like Pecha Kucha so much, right?
You got it, Pecha Kucha. Long live Pecha Kucha. I think that there are some wishes on that.
I think I can offer Louis a little bit of relief in terms of his concern. In my experience and following my model in terms of responding to emotional kinds of things, my experience says that if you are listening in a way that your speaker believes you're trying to understand, if you make your best guess at what that emotion is, they'll just correct you. And all you have to do is just accept the correction.
Okay, thank you. May I just ask or say something in relation to what Anita was saying? Thank you. It's about the different languages, and going back to the topic of disagreements in families or in relationships. I think we all know that right now, in our current times, more and more couples and families are intercultural and speak different languages at home. And so I do think that it's an interesting and very relevant question, this question about how to listen to your couple if either you don't speak her language or his language, or you think you speak that language. So I'm saying that because German is my second language, and I used to live in Germany, and I have a German girlfriend, and we had lots of conflicts, and I think many of the conflicts were because I was fluent in German, so she thought we were speaking the same language, but I was actually meaning something different very often. So that goes, just to say that.
That's a very interesting insight there, Louis. And that actually, I think, would make a great Pecha Kucha for next year's conference, or a session for next year's conference. Juliana actually said, emotion is also a cultural expression. Languages are the manifestation of a whole world view. So I've asked her to tell me more. So if she tells me more, I will relay that to you. And Catherine Black also had to sign off. She said, sorry all, I'm starting to fade. It's 3:56 a.m., so I'm off to bed again. Here's to flying to the other side of the world in March to see you all. Thank you again, Anita and Sheila. So I hope that we can see Catherine next year for sure in Canada.
That would be great. Thank you so much for staying up.
I see that it is almost the hour again. So is there anyone else who would like to participate or send in a comment before we sign off?
Just a very big thank you to all of you.
Absolutely.
Sure, you participate in International Day of Listening. Someone, one person, that's good.
Yeah, absolutely. And so on behalf of ILA, I definitely thank both Anita and Sheila and everyone else on this call today. And happy listening.
Thank you very much.
Happy listening. Do widzenia. Buenos dias. Buenas tardes.
Ciao. Buenos dias.
Buenos dias.
Okay.
Adios.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.